And I thought that was interesting because Jesus is speaking to a large crowd. And I feel normally when we talk about how to become a disciple of Jesus, we talk about what you can do. Jesus is using negative language. He's talking about what you can't do. If you do this, you cannot be my disciple. Or if you don't do this, you cannot be my disciple. So I thought that was an interesting approach. His point very clear as we move forward. But it's not very tolerant language of Jesus, is it? That doesn't sound very inclusive. It sounds very exclusive. So anyway, jump into the text. So verse 26 and 27, I'll reread it real quick. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So Jesus doesn't waste any time here. He's going right for the throat. Who here values family relationships? They're pretty important too, right? My hand goes up as well, as it did. I love my wife and my two little ones more than anyone. Both my brother and I love him. I'm sure many critics of the Christian faith love this passage. They probably point and say, see, he's crazy. You're crazy. Everybody but me is crazy. But what we have to remember about Scripture is that it's in a particular context. Jesus was a real human being speaking to real people in a real way. He understood hyperbole. He understood colloquialism. So when he says, hate my family, he is trying to prove a point. And that point is not anything nor anyone should be sitting on his throne in my life, in your life. So if we think of things that we place up high on Christ's throne, can you name some for me? I'll start with one, and that would be maybe school. Maybe schooling replaces Christ in your life on a day-to-day basis. School's the focus. Does anybody else have anything else that they might want to throw on that list of what distracts this, what gets popped up there on the throne? Dating, relationships, the gym, money, what people think of you, people's perception of you. You could throw ego in there maybe. Comfort. So pretty much anything, right? Video games. Oh man, there was a day. That day is not today. But there was a day where I could probably admit that. But pretty much really anything that we could possibly think of, that we could possibly exalt in our lives, could take the throne. So jumping down to verse 27, where he talks about bearing our own cross. Does anybody have any inkling as to what it means to carry your cross? Any guesses? Any guesses?
I think that one perception, at least that I've been told, is like whatever persecution you're going through is your cross.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are being fun at school, that's the cross you bear.
Mm-hmm. So personal ridicule would be the cross that you have to bear. Maybe a difficult situation you're going through, like I don't know, family member's sick, that's your cross to bear. Maybe trials in life is your cross to bear. Does anybody know what it means to bear your cross in the historical context? So we just talked about Jesus being a real person in a real place in a real time. What does it mean for Jesus talking to his audience in the first century when he says, carry your own thing? Yeah, it's the death march, right? So Jesus was foreshadowing his death whenever he talks about carrying your cross. He's foreshadowing not only his death, but also the potentiality of the death of his true disciples, right? At a crucifixion, it was possible for the victim, the perpetrator, to carry the crossbeam of their own cross to the site of their death. A difficult and demeaning dilemma for sure, but you were a dead man anyway, just less work for them to do. So this statement wasn't intended to mean, will you have businesses turn down your request for health care baskets from me? Or will you be ridiculed at school for me? Or are you prepared to not be allowed on Rowan campus for me? Which is some of the things that we're facing right now as a church. This is not what Jesus is talking about. The statement that Jesus is making is, will you die for me? Death or bust. See, Jesus, like many leaders, isn't interested in half-assed disciples. Our workplaces don't allow it. Our colleges don't allow it. Our parents don't allow it. Why would Jesus allow it? Jesus makes reference to death again in Matthew 10, 37 to 38. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. This gives us some clarity into Jesus' real intent behind the words, whoever will find his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. This challenges our the thing that gives us worth is literally sacrifice for Christ's sake, not some of the things that we might be inclined to think, such as people's perception of us or excellence in our job. As Christians, shouldn't that be true for all of us? For Christ's sake. Is it true for us? What have we sacrificed? Just something to think about. So continuing on in verses 28 through 33. Breaking it down, Jesus moves now to some more practical examples. His call might sound outlandish at first, but honestly, he's only being consistent with other areas of life, like we talked about earlier, like workplace, parents, colleges. His standards are consistent with those even. The following examples follow the process of contemplating, not just rushing in, not diving right in. We're talking about contemplating before committing. So he gives an example in 28 through 30 of a man building a tower and counting the cost. He warns that if a man starts building and gets partway through and doesn't have enough to finish, he'll be ridiculed. He'll be a fool. People will point and there'll be a half a tower sitting there, and they'll know who built half a tower, who couldn't finish half a tower. It's better to have no tower than half a tower and no money to complete it. If you walked into a bank today and wanted a loan to start a business, wouldn't they want a detailed plan, projected costs and success rates, how big of a risk, margin of error? We have some small business owners. Wouldn't they want to know that? We need to approach our commitment to Christ in the same fashion. It's only fair we know what we're getting into, right? And Jesus doesn't want half-assed disciples. He wants us to know lifelong service of sacrifice for his name. We must realize this or face the reality that the cries of hypocrite might not be unfounded. We need to live consistently with Christ's call to our lives. He gives another example. He ups the ante a little bit in the second one. He moves from counting possessions to counting human life. This is not to downplay counting human possessions, but it's meant to exalt the value. As humans, we are constantly considering the value of things. After all, we are made in God's image, and therefore we reflect some of those character qualities in our own lives without even knowing it. And God himself places different values on different things. Human life is above all. We are the crown of his creation. He gave us souls that will carry on without our earthly bodies so that we would have the chance to fellowship and worship with him forever. God places a huge emphasis on the value of human life. But what happens when we don't value human souls as much as God values them? Letting people pass us by and not taking opportunities that God might be putting in place for us. We miss those opportunities. We chicken out. We don't engage. We forget our call. We shame his name. We worry about our status. We try and save face. We don't give generally. We don't engage with our local churches. We should. We don't. In verses 31 and 32, he's speaking of a king who's deliberating massing troops to meet an oncoming force. Can he win with 10,000 against 20? Possibly. Very good armies can. The Israelites faced worse odds in the Old Testament, but they had God as a king then. We're talking earthly kings. So can you feel the weight of having the responsibility of human life in your hands? I know as a healthcare worker, I feel like sometimes, not that I have those, I just do what the doctors tell me to, but the reality is if someone's dying in front of you and you're trying your best to save them, that weight is on your hands. But this king deliberating, he doesn't have just one human life on his hands. He has thousands. He has 10,000 human lives to consider. And you wouldn't be simply a fool, as the man who didn't count the cost of his tower in the earlier verses. You'd be a fool and a murderer if you didn't count the cost well, and your army got obliterated. So in the same way a king deliberates in his war room, we are to deliberate about becoming a disciple of Christ. The same thought and care that a man planning a war, counting the cost of human lives, that's the same attitude that we're to have approaching a commitment to Christ and to his church. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So to sum up so far, Jesus says the cost of discipleship is not unlike building a tower or massing an army. You've got to count the cost. But if a man was a fool and misappropriated funds for a tower, he at least still has his possession. A king might send his army to meet in battle, and he could lose men and be named a murderer, but he would still have men left over. He could lose a battle, but not necessarily forfeit a war. So let's consider verses 26 and 27 again. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. A Jesus follower has a different call. We have a different responsibility placed in front of us than mere possessions or other people's lives. We have our own lives here on the line that we're accounting for. And he is given to give up this life or don't even bother, essentially. Be prepared to give up anything or don't come to the table. See, nowadays in our American Christianity, we hear people say, you need to give Jesus your life. And they mean things like Sunday afternoons for worship, Wednesday nights for community group or youth group, maybe 5 minutes in the morning for prayer, maybe 5 minutes if you get the chance. But when Jesus says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple, he means if you're not willing to die for him in the worst way possible, you cannot be one of my followers. He's making it fairly clear cut, and the stakes are very high. I think oftentimes we look at the words of Jesus as an illustration, as something other than what they say. After all, he did talk in riddles and parables a lot. But this is as straight up as you can get. Jesus is looking to the cross, literally looking to the cross and saying, if you won't follow me there, what makes me think that you'll follow me long term? If you're not willing to follow me short term, what makes me think you'll follow me long term? And I think that that's fair. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So from there, Jesus moves on into a discussion about salt and light. And if you've been in church for any amount of time, you've probably heard a sermon or two on salt and light. It's a common theme throughout the Bible. And Jesus uses one more example for us, just in case we didn't get the point up till now. He starts talking about salt. This one might be a little more cultural, since we don't find it as many uses for salt as they did in the first century. Does anybody know how they got salt in this region? Any clue as to what current day tourist attraction they were near? The Dead Sea. Aptly named because nothing will live in it due to its high salt content. The Israelites would harvest salt. They'd be pouring it in water. They would be pouring the water into basins, allowing the water to evaporate. And this would be used for things like cleansing, preservation, flavoring, fertilization, sacrifices. They have multiple different uses. We just use it to get, but they found a lot of different uses for it back then. But if the salt wasn't harvested properly, it would be mixed with other minerals and become literally useless. And that's what Jesus is talking about in this passage. Jesus says it's not even good for the manure pile. And if you're not good enough for the manure pile, what are you good enough for? So it's thrown away. It's literally thrown away. There is no use for it. It's cast down. It's frustrating because it's a waste, and now you got to find some place to put this because it's just literally of no use for anything. It just becomes job security for trash collectors is really all it becomes. But Jesus also talks about salt. In Matthew chapter 5, called the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus mentions salt in the same way, saying, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." So in this passage, we see some of the mystery taken away from Luke's passage. Jesus implies what the salt represents. The salt represents the Christian life. This makes the passage hit very heavy, feel the weight of this. He who has ears, let him hear. He's talking about an unproductive Christian life is basically worthless. There is no value to find in it. It is not advancing the kingdom forward. It's moving the kingdom backward. It is useless. There is no place in the kingdom for a stagnant Christian. He's saying that part of your worth if you're not advancing the kingdom. But don't tell our American churches this. It'll really hurt their feelings and probably their budgets. But here at MD, we don't want to be just another American church. We want to be Jesus' church. We want to advance the kingdom, and we want you to join us. But that means you need to count the cost. You need to truly consider if you're going to go the distance to face rejection, to be so bold as to lose your family for the sake of Christ if need be. If not, don't change. Don't change, but you lose your sense of purpose, satisfaction, and delight in Christ if you become complacent. Coming to church isn't enough. That's being stationary. That's events during service, at breakfast, in class, during free period, when you commute to work, at the dinner table, on Facebook, Twitter, chat, everywhere. So join us. Join us in advancing the kingdom. Come follow a loving God. Come worship a risen King. Those of you here who are regular attenders, I encourage you to join us and commit to MD. We need you. Without you, it might not happen. So commit. To our covenant community members who have partnered with us in advancing the kingdom, get active. You've made the commitment. You've already signed the documents. You're already on our list. Evaluate where you're at. Are you active in our community? Are you active in MD Online? Are you active in signing up for events and giving generously? And helping gather resources that we give out at the community? Get active. Get active. Deacons, engage. Engage with the mission and the vision of Missio Dei. Be proactive in servant leadership. Follow Jesus and the elders he has set before you in the vision they have for this city. Look for ways to engage with our community that we've never thought about before. Don't wait for events to happen to kick into high gear. Be beacons of resourcefulness and commitment to the community. Engage. And pray. Pray for the elders of this church, that we may not simply be, but that we be men of action, practical men, discipling you, going before you, and ways you should go. Pray. Pray for your leaders. He who has ears, let him hear. So we're gonna traipse right along into respond time. This is probably one of the shortest lessons that I've ever taught. But as worship team comes up for respond time, I'll just explain it a little bit. What we do here at MD, we respond to worship, in worship to Jesus.